Okay, hello. Today we're going to be talking about lessons learned across three different projects, which would be the Hoover Dam, Apollo 1, and Hamilton the Musical. And this was made by us three as a group. My name is Moses, as well as Reef Powers and Mary Leming. We are all here together. So if we could go to the next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is the agenda behind this presentation. So we're going to be analyzing the three projects that I just mentioned previously, and these are very different projects. Some were taken on by the government, others were just a musical that was produced privately. But the point behind this is that each project, while it's very different from each other, they have the same principles behind them. And after we talk about each different project, the principles behind each different project, and we will talk about the lessons learned from each project. We're going to also discuss the best practices that we learned all together from all three projects. We're going to discuss the best practices that we can implement to any project. And then we're going to talk about how things that we gained from these projects, as well as from the class in general, that we can apply to our future careers. And finally, we're also going to answer some questions, some frequently asked questions at the end. So if we could go to the next slide. So first, how do we choose these projects? Well, we chose these projects because we focused on different industries. So, for example, Hamilton, as I said before, it's a private musical. It's a production on Broadway. Apollo 1 is a space mission, which was taken on by NASA. And the Hoover Dam was taken on during the Great Depression. So very different backgrounds, but still one same lesson learned, I guess. And one was a success, very great success, which was the Hoover Dam, which was finished ahead of schedule and under budget. One was a failure, at least at first, which is Apollo 1. And one is geared towards a personal preference, which is Mary's Hamilton. So again, the same principles, and we're going to be analyzing communication of each project, the leadership, planning, the risk in each project, all these things. So next slide. So the things that are examined as well are going to be the background of the project, the goals that the project had as we went into it, the context of each project. We're going to look at the stakeholders behind each project, the tools, the techniques that were used to undertake the project, life cycle phases of the project, and the scope, the schedule, the budget, which is the triple constraint. We're going to analyze that as well. And finally, the lessons learned for each individual project.
At the time, the Hoover Dam, and till this day, was considered one of America's greatest engineering projects. The Colorado River was a massive river that was very inconsistent in flooding, but flooded a ton and needed a change. There was also a lack of water supply to nearby towns that needed to be addressed, as well as power for large cities such as LA and Arizona and Nevada, and they needed power. This was also right in the middle of the Great Depression, meaning there was not a ton of money to just be thrown around, and they had to be very tight on budgeting and timeline because time is money. This project ended up finishing 2 years ahead of plan, saving a bunch of money, and then the budget was also very tight because there's political and financial demands, so they had to work together to create this project. Next slide. The Hoover Dam was not only a project to show the engineering power America had, but it was also because there were some huge issues that needed to be solved. The Colorado River frequently flooded, causing damages to many farms and towns near, and put the lives of many at risk. Not only was this important for flood control, but it also provides power to over 1 million people across Nevada, Arizona, and California, as well as creates large water source for things like irrigation and drinking. With frequent flooding, as well as inconsistent water supplies, farming was pretty much impossible without a fix. The Great Depression was also going on, meaning the government was eager to find extra jobs, and this project luckily was a way to add thousands of jobs. Next slide. The construction of this project wasn't possible without key stakeholders, the first being the U.S. federal government, who helped with funding the entire project. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation was charged with planning it and monitoring it throughout its construction. The 6 companies was a company built up of 6 different people who were in charge of building the dam itself and creating a budget and estimate for the completed project. Finally, all the citizens and communities and farmers involved who were directly affected by this project because they were the ones who were benefiting from the power plant and the water provided. Next slide. With the project being constructed in the early to mid 1900s, there wasn't a ton of modern day project management techniques such as the work breakdown structure. However, they were still able to use a different version of this without having the official title. They divided this project into smaller groups such as excavating, concrete, and tunnel work, essentially creating their own version of the work breakdown structure. Fortunately, there was still project management techniques that were already in place, one being the Gantt chart to create weekly plans as well as to monitor the overall progress. Finally, with a project of this size, and in a time where they needed to save every dollar possible, they had to come up with a perfect budgeting strategy. They ended up going with a budgeting strategy known as fixed price budget, which set a fixed price that couldn't be gone over, and this was to balance financial control and political pressure. This method worked very well as they ended up finishing under budget. Next slide. The Hoover Dam followed a similar cycle that modern project managers use today. First, they plan the entirety of the project for many years in advance, creating blueprints and selecting the best location for this project, as well as hiring contractors and creating a manageable budget. They then moved on to the execution phase where they built tunnels and excavated land to prepare for the dam, and then built the actual dam and power plant. Simultaneously, they closely monitored and controlled the project to ensure safety and to make sure the budget and timeline were still on track. Finally, they did final inspections and opened up the plant and water supplies, marking the completion of this project. Next slide. The Hoover Dam construction, being the first of its kind, meant there was not really data to look back on and lessons that were already learned, so they had to come up with their own. One lesson is that was not properly assessing risks, leading to many injuries and sometimes death. The harsh conditions of the site created many hazardous situations, such as people falling from high up, debris falling on them, or getting overheated from the blazing temperatures. Throughout the project, they even got better on safety. However, this should have been something they planned on from the start. Another lesson learned from the beginning was to ensure you have a clear scope from the beginning of the project. Due to the size and lack of reference available, they had a very hard time being confident with their plan, leading to fairly vague material. They also struggled with creating a clear plan on how to divert the water while the dam was being built. Not all lessons learned from this were failures, however, but methods like how they budgeted provided a good lesson on how project managers should budget their project in the future, especially when it's this size. Next slide.
All right, so the next project that we talked about, that we analyzed, is Apollo 1. So this was another massive project undertaken by the United States government this was after the Hoover Dam, so after the Great Depression. It was during the Cold War. And this is an example of how a project that is not well managed can cause great failure, catastrophe, and even loss of life. In this case, 3 astronauts were killed in a fire because of mismanagement of the project, and many changes had to be undertaken afterwards. So Apollo 1 was supposed to be a simulation test, so for the eventual moon landings. So it was going to be the first manned test where they were going to send astronauts into orbit for the eventual moon landings that were going to take place. So the U.S. government was in a space race against the Soviet Union at this time. So they were trying to get to the moon by the end of the decade. So there was a pretty significant time constraint on this project, and NASA was rushing to get to the moon as quick as possible. So next slide. So again, it was supposed to be the first crewed mission. During the it wasn't even during the actual flight that the fire occurred. It was actually during a pre-simulation, a pre-flight simulation, that the fire suddenly occurred. And the main reasons for this were a lack of safety precautions that caused the death of everyone on board. One of these was that the inside of the craft was filled with pure oxygen instead of a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. And this revealed many deep issues in project management at NASA. So next slide. So there were many stakeholders. This being a public project taken by the U.S. government, there were many different stakeholders. First and foremost, obviously, was NASA itself and the leadership at NASA, but also obvious stakeholders were the astronauts, who were probably the most important stakeholders, the one that had most carrying on this because they lost their lives. The engineers were also stakeholders, contractors that were involved. NASA used contractors to for many of their projects, a lot of the construction behind the projects. They used contractors. The U.S. government itself, including Congress, which oversaw the aftermath of the accident. Congress oversaw it and analyzed what happened. The public itself was a distant but still also a stakeholder. And communication throughout this whole project was poor. In the after report of the project, NASA itself said that nobody knew anything beyond his specific area of responsibility. So this is an example of siloing within the project, which is that everyone is closed off from the other parts of the project, and they only know what's going on within their small group or their small section of the project, which is not a good thing. So next slide. Some tools and techniques that NASA used were phase planning, which is similar to a work breakdown structure. They also use milestones. They use monthly progress reports as well. So these were some of the tools that NASA used to keep their project more organized. Next slide. And then in the project lifecycle, they did not fully map out their scope. They did not do scope planning correctly at the start, and they also did not monitor the conditions correctly because, again, the 100% pure oxygen atmosphere caused a lot of flammability. Monitoring was weak also among contractors. So again, NASA used contractors for the project, and they did not monitor these contractors well enough. So for the closing, they had to investigate the accident after the astronauts lost their lives, along with congressional oversight. So next slide. For scope, schedule, and budget issues, which represents the triple constraint, I saw that there was a lot of scope creep in this project, where NASA did not accurately outlined the scope, and this ended up causing massive time delays as well as budget overruns. And in the end, because of the accident, it caused 410 million extra dollars to redesign the spacecraft to be safer, and it added 18 months to the schedule. So next slide. So NASA obviously had to make significant changes after this. Two of the most notable changes that I saw directly from the spacecraft were that they installed an outward opening hatch to make it easier to leave the spacecraft in the case of a fire or an accident. They also made an atmosphere that was not pure oxygen, but was nitrogen and oxygen. They increased the communication between contractors. They added more oversight between NASA leadership and contractors. And they started planning more future oriented. So they didn't go in blind anymore. They planned out their projects beforehand. Next slide. And lessons learned in general is that planning and scope require definition from the start. So you can't just go into the project without knowing the full extent of what you're going to do, as well as communication. Communication is very important, and you need to communicate these goals not just to leadership, but to all the stakeholders within the project. So everyone needs to know what they're getting into beforehand. Scope must also be defined early, and risks. Risks is also very important, something that cannot be ignored within any project. So all these lessons apply not just to NASA, but to any project that is being undertaken. Next slide.
All right, now we're on to Hamilton. So Hamilton is a wildly successful musical. It is a hip hop and rap musical written by Lin-Manuel Miranda that redefined genre and casting boundaries on Broadway. Hamilton does what's called race-blind casting, where they're not looking for specifically a white actor to play this role and a black actor to play this role. It is simply whoever's best fit for the job, barring the role of King George III, who is like mandatorily white. Everybody else is up for debate. It is still running on Broadway after about 10 and a half years at this point. It's had many national tours, international tours, a stint on West End, a stint in Chicago, and then there's the pro shot on Disney Plus that has the original Broadway cast in it. And although we were just talking about the importance of not taking too many risks, and at least being aware of them, taking calculated risks and being open in communications are pivotal to the success of Hamilton. So the background is written by Lin-Manuel Miranda over a 6-year period, started in 2009, and he was making changes to the script and lyrics and blocking all this stuff like within days leading up to opening on Broadway. He aimed to write a rap and hip hop musical about the founding father Alexander Hamilton while he was on vacation from In the Heights, which is a musical that was previously on Broadway and has also had a movie adaptation. He read Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton. He thought, wouldn't it be hilarious if I wrote a rap and hip hop musical about this guy? And then he did. So yeah, opened in 2015, and barring the COVID closure, it's running to this day with truly no end in sight. Stakeholders and communication. Stakeholders include essentially anybody involved in like the creation, production, distribution, and conception of this musical. There were 3 lead producers, the artistic team who's in charge of writing, composition, choreography, costume, makeup. The list truly goes on, especially in a musical. The performers, there were over 100 external investors. The list hasn't been published, but there are like a couple people have come out and said like, oh, I put X amount of money towards, et cetera, et cetera. And then also audiences. And regarding communication, Miranda was very open in his communication, both with his team and with audiences throughout the writing process and after the musical had opened on Broadway. Tools and techniques. There's not much information publicly available about specific tools and techniques used. There's a lot of information about the writing process and the creative process of here's how I came up with these lyrics and came up with this melody and all of that stuff, but there isn't like a publicly available like budget breakdown. There are like standard forms that they'll follow where a certain percent goes towards casting and a certain percent goes towards theater rentals, so on and so forth. We do know that Hamilton had a $12.5 million budget though. And this show involved phase planning. So there was like the writing phase, going through workshops, like testing out different actors and certain roles, seeing how songs worked. There was an off-Broadway run at the Public Theater, and then the Broadway production, and then following the national tours and Disney Plus. So the project lifecycle. This can be interpreted in a couple different ways, as the process of producing a musical is so like fluid. So for the purposes of this assignment, the planning phase lasted from the first performance at the White House in 2009 up until its opening night on Broadway, as changes were still being made up until show day. Execution will say lasted through the first year of performances, and then everything following is in the monitoring phase as the project is still technically ongoing. So it will not be closed until the current Broadway run closes. Lessons learned, calculated risks are necessary, especially in creative fields. Nobody's life is on the line when you're saying, I think it'd be fun to write a musical about a founding father. And it's also important to draw on previous experiences with when starting a new project and drawing on any connections he may had. He had been involved in various musicals prior to deciding to create Hamilton, and as such knew how he writes best. And he had composers that he's worked with before, and choreographers that he's worked with before, and other connections in the industry to get him where he wanted to go with the creative aspect and then also the planning process. The 3 lead producers that he hired, whose names I'm completely blanking on right now, all had a crazy resume of experience putting on these shows. And then he also shows the importance of open communication throughout the writing process, and then throughout its run on Broadway, lasting till now. Miranda would post little behind-the-scenes snippets on mainly Instagram and then a couple other social media platforms, talking about, oh, on this day 3 years ago, I started writing my shot, or here's a video of Leslie Odom Jr., who originated the role of Aaron Burr. Here's a clip of his audition, or here's a clip of my demo of the first song before it was even performed at the White House. So the just the popularity of his openness also was able to act as free advertisement and built trust with the stakeholders. So he might not necessarily have been giving them monthly updates or things like that, but they were still able to see that things were progressing. Regarding like scope, budget, and schedule, the scope has to be insanely wide. You have to cover creative differences. You have to cover like the performance aspect, just a very, very wide scope, but there were professionals dedicated to each section within the scope. Budget, again, not much is known about how close they were to sticking to budget, if they went over, if they were under, the specific breakdown of who contributed what. And then schedule is, again, hard to define, as it's all based on the progress that Miranda made while writing the musical. It took him 3 years to finalize My Shot, but some of the songs only took him a couple months. But once the musical was written and the opening run on off Broadway at the Public Theater started, things were far more solidified in their schedule of, okay, we can open on Broadway in X amount of months once we hit all of these requirements and fill out the forms and the documentation and all that stuff.
So there was a lot of best practices amongst every group, but combining them, there is many similarities. One of them, being able to break down large projects into smaller components, which is the work breakdown structure, is very important. And all 3 of these were able to have a phase of that. Budget planning was also arguably one of the most crucial parts of any project, and proper planning amongst that was very crucial. And the Hoover Dams was successful. NASA failed, as they talked about. And then Hamilton also had a say in that as well. There's also risks have to be considered in any project, especially if they're more harmful to people. The Hoover Dam struggled a lot with heat exhaustion because it's Nevada and it's very hot. NASA did not place enough emphasis on their 100% oxygen environment and led to an explosion that killed a bunch. Hamilton tested the show to reduce risks early on. Documenting lessons learned were also a very big part of this, so that you could learn from your mistakes. In the closing stages of the Hoover Dam, that was where they would do that. The results of the Apollo accident were all documented, and the results of the success of Hamilton were all documented. The use and tools of techniques to improve the result of the final project is very crucial. And the Hoover Dam was more technical in this aspect. NASA was more managerial, and then the Hamilton was more creative in their tools and technique. One big question with the Hoover Dam is, when was it built? So the technical building of this was between 1931 and 1936. That includes pouring concrete, excavating tunnels and all that, and then completing it and delivering the power and water. But the entirety of the project started, well in the 1800s, where they started discovering that there was flooding that needed to be controlled. And then in 1902, the president really took initiative in this, signing an act that kind of started the planning process for this project. Another question is the Hoover Dam still in use? And if so, what is it being used for? So the Hoover Dam is very much still in use. and it's still being used for the whole purpose of it was flood control. It's been very good at that, and it's the main purpose of it. It still provides power to 1.3 million people, and also provides water for over 16 million people annually.
Okay, so for Apollo, one question is what would I have done differently as a project manager? And I think the two biggest things I would have done differently are going to be first, I would have defined the scope at the beginning so we would know how much was going to be spent, as well as defining risks from the beginning. So we could define like for example, the oxygen atmosphere, make it nitrogen and oxygen. And the second thing I would have done as project manager would be to increase communication to not do the siloing that was happening a lot during this project. So those are two things that I would do differently as project manager. And how does Apollo 1 show the need for ethical responsibility in projects? Well, especially projects like this one and Apollo, the Hoover Dam, when people's lives are on the line, it is the project manager's responsibility to make sure that they are documenting all the risks, that they are taking all the risks into account so that they can prevent serious accidents like what ended up occurring with Apollo.
Okay, so one commonly asked question is, where did Miranda get the idea for this musical? It came while he was on break from In the Heights, picked up a biography about Hamilton and thought, wow, this guy's life was really entertaining. He was an immigrant, he was an orphan, he had an affair, just all these sort of things. Spoiler alert, he died in a duel, and thought that it would be just a really entertaining person to write about. And then how did Miranda's experience with other musicals impact his decisions about Hamilton? He had learned the importance of taking risks early on. His previous, I wouldn't say smash hit, but it was still widely successful, musical is In the Heights, and it follows a like a Hispanic area in New York City, and it uses a lot of like Latin influences in its music. So he's always been about like challenging what can be considered a musical beyond standard classical music, and like Les Mis and Phantom of the Opera. Like how could those boundaries be pushed? And then he also learned the importance of not making empty promises on I'll have this song to you by X date, or I'll be done at this certain time. It's going to be this long. It's going to have X, Y, and Z in it, because the process is so fluid. It's important to like trust yourself and let people have that trust in you.
So for career takeaways, things that I could apply from these projects that I could apply to my personal career is that first, these principles are universal. So it doesn't matter if it was at NASA, Hamilton, or the Hoover Dam. These things like scope, risk management, communication, these apply to any project. So for example, some projects I've worked on is home remodeling. These things, risk management is definitely very important for home modeling. Scope planning is also very important. So these are some things that I could apply to my career.
So one thing that I gained from this project and the class as a whole is a further understanding of the project management process. My mom at one point acted as a project manager, and I would overhear her talking with her clients and her team members, and then also like my dad talking about what she was doing on the day-to-day. And I'd understand snippets here and there, but after taking this class and working on this project, I further understand like the significance of the details that she was talking about. And then I also gained a new perspective towards my actions in previous projects, where if you've read my discussion posts, you'll know that pretty much all the projects that I've done are related to theater, specifically high school theater. I was a stage manager for a couple of productions, and I would also focus on sound and understanding that even though I didn't know what a work breakdown structure was, or a Gantt chart or anything like that, I would still implement tools akin to those to help the process.
One thing I learned from this, or going into this, I really didn't know like the ins and outs of project management, but through this project and the course in general, I was able to learn like the specifics of, the Gantt chart, the work breakdown structure, the project charter. But also, a big thing that I learned was that you can really use this on any size of project. I mean, clearly the Hoover Dam was a huge project, but then we also did the material of creating a birthday party. So you can really use it on anything. And I think that going through this, I've developed a lot of skills I need to start developing my career as a project manager. Also, going into this class, I didn't know if this was what I wanted to do, but through this class and through this project, I learned that I do want to be a project manager, and specifically a construction manager, which luckily the project I did was on a construction-based project. And so I learned like what managing those job sites would be like, how to manage them, what tools are necessary, how to assess risk and all that involved. And then coincidentally, I'm interning with a company this summer, and it's going to be with a power group. So that I will definitely be able to utilize a lot of the information I learned from this project into the internship and hopefully my career in general.
All right. Well, great job, y'all.
I think honestly, I'm sure that went a decent